Welcome to the Supported Living Property Podcast with your host, me, Lisa Brown, the place to learn about supported living property investing. Hi, it's great to have you both here today. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Unfortunately, I'm in my son's bedroom because of roadwork, so it's an interesting environment.
Yeah, we had a conversation about teenage boys' bedrooms earlier, didn't we? Yeah, not necessarily a place of choice, I'm sure. Lauren, lovely to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, happy to be here.
Do you want to introduce yourself and tell people a bit about you, Lauren, if you start with you?
So I'm Lauren Blood. I work at the National Development Team for Inclusion, NDTI. I'm a research officer there. And I spent about 2 years working on this project that we're going to be talking about today, 200 Lives. We'll be hearing more about that.
Fantastic. And Chris, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Chris Hatton. I'm a Professor of Social Care at Manchester Metropolitan University, also a member of the team. The project was long in the making and long in the doing. So we're very chuffed to have some findings to be able to share with people.
Fantastic. It's great to have you here today. I guess, going right back to the beginning of this, what was the aims of the study when you set out to do this? What were you trying to achieve?
I think the aims of the project were really straightforward. So some 20 years before, I've been involved in research that was looking at the quality and costs of what was then group homes, residential care, some kind of larger establishments for people with learning disabilities. And really, I think in the 20 years since, there's been very little evidence for service providers, commissioners, and people with learning disabilities to go on sort of decent research evidence about what the quality of supported living and residential care are for adults with learning disabilities, what the costs are linked with that, and what makes a good home for people.
And really important stuff, because we talk about supported living so much, don't we? Lots of local authority, members, providers, everyone's talking about it as a really great way to deliver care, but actually you're right, there's very little evidence behind that. So yeah, really important. How did you actually go about doing this then? It's a big thing to try and achieve, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think it's important to say we started the project in February 2020. So obviously not the ideal time to be starting something, as obviously there was quite a lot of disruption from COVID. And we had been sort of hoping to visit a lot of people at home. And obviously that wasn't possible for everyone because of COVID restrictions. So we had to pivot slightly, but we still managed to get sort of quite a lot of people interested in wanting to take part. So we sort of put a call out to different residential care and supported living providers and just said, would you be interested in sort of contributing to the research? And if so, can you put us in touch with people who you support who might want to take part? So we sort of went to the different providers first, and we had loads of providers who were really interested. But obviously with COVID, it was different sort of how many actually were able to find people and how many weren't. And we had a real range, like some put forward one person, some I think the most we had was maybe, I think it was about 16 or 17 people from the same provider. And again, a real mixture of some people who live by themselves, some people who live in houses of up to 10 people. Sometimes we'd speak to just one person, sometimes we'd speak to their housemates as well. So it was really varied. And then what the main part of the research, I guess, was speaking to people with learning disabilities and asking them some questions about where they live and what they think about it. And then we were really keen to also get a broader understanding of their life in general. So it's not just their house, but it's also how does their house fit into their life? What kind of life do they have? Does it help them to have a good life? So we did have quite a lot of questions. So we often spoke to people more than once, maybe 2 or 3 times, and mostly over Zoom, which was quite interesting. To get a little peek into people's rooms and meet their pets and things like that.
I guess in some ways you probably saw a less curated version because it was over Zoom than you might have done if you'd met in a clinical room or something like that, perhaps, so yeah. Yeah,
it was interesting. And they also got to sort of see a peek into our homes, which was quite nice. It was a bit more sort of equal than us going there. We did do some home visits towards the end, but yeah, mostly it was over Zoom or over the phone. And then we also asked support staff to fill out some questionnaires for us. And this would be a bit more information about the person's life and what support they get. And then if the person was happy for it, we sent a questionnaire to their family as well. So they could nominate a family member, but only if they gave consent for that. And then we were trying to sort of get the family's perspective on it as well. And I think we were trying to understand our families having a lot more input in certain contexts rather than others. So we were trying to get sort of various different perspectives on it.
Fantastic. So a huge amount of information gathering and then trying to pull that all together must have been a massive piece of work for you. Absolutely. So I guess what were the main findings? What are the key findings that we need to know about?
So we've put together sort of 10 key findings, which you can find on the website, and there's an easy read version as well. But
pop the links to that in the show notes so everyone can find those. Absolutely.
Yeah. But broadly speaking, I mean, one of the things we really were interested in is what's important to people and what makes a good home for someone. And we heard sort of, these were actually fairly consistent across supported living and residential care. Even though we were comparing the two, there weren't huge differences in terms of what's important to someone in one would often be important to someone in another. One of the real key messages is who people live with is probably one of the most important things. People were consistently saying that the people they live with or the staff were one of their favourite things about where they live. And equally, if they didn't get along with people, that could be a real sort of make or break thing for people, more so than the actual house itself. So that really needs to be considered quite carefully. And that's interesting because we did find from speaking to people that people didn't have that much choice in who they lived with, or if they wanted to live with other people or live by themselves, it was often they'd met people once, they'll say yes, but they didn't necessarily know them before, they didn't know if it would work out. So I think taking the time to sort of take that process a bit more slowly would be quite important to people. And then when it came to the actual house, more so than the sort of layout of the facilities, it was about people being able to put their own stamp on it. So whether they were living in a shared house or their own place, it was really important. They took real pride in making it their own, decorating it, doing gardening, even sort of tidying and having that pride in where they were. So having that autonomy over the space, I think, was really important to people and sort of putting their own mark on it so it feels like their home.
And that was in residential settings and in supported living settings. That was key.
Yeah. And in sort of places where people did share, it was quite important that they had space not just in their room. So they may have their own spot that they often sit in, or they have a shed, or so their own sort of space extends beyond just their room, if that makes sense.
Okay, so not necessarily a whole room but like a chair or a part of a room that would be for them. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, or
it just naturally sort of fell into, this is my sort of zone and I take charge of this bit. So just having that more autonomy, I think. And then there was a real thing around community and the place where people live, and we did find that people in supported living tended to be more connected to their communities, tend to live more in the community rather than sort of slightly separate, and they were more sort of, for better or worse, more integrated into the community. The reason I say for better or worse is, again, that could be a good or a bad thing depending on where they live. They may be more affected by issues in the neighbourhood.
Such as what kind of things when you're saying issues in the neighbourhood?
Just in terms of sort of there might be more issues with neighbours than there would be in residential care. So it's, again, the area is really, really important to think about and get it right for people. And yeah, so again, with supported living, sort of transport links were really important. We found that often in residential care, people were more go out all together, maybe have their own transport linked with the home, whereas in supported living, it may be more important that there's sort of good bus links or good public transport in the area. And I think it was really important to people that they had those sort of roots in the community. So being able to live somewhere a while, being able to know people, and not just sort of, there was a real thing about sort of familiar faces and knowing people to say hi to. And I think that's quite important to everyone during COVID, but that really came out in this of sort of knowing friendly faces around and feeling like you're part of the community, definitely.
So people like people in the corner shop, people, neighbours, people knowing people and feeling like you fit in. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Were there any other key findings from there before we move on? There's so many. I mean, obviously all the stuff's on the site, but
there is a lot of stuff. I guess one thing that's I think was quite important to note was that the range of support needs of people living in supported living and residential care. So though on average people living in residential care had greater support needs, you found people with a full range of support needs in both supported living and residential care. So I guess for us, that showed that supported living can be successful with people with a full range of support needs. I guess the thing that goes with that and that was linked to costings is that if you're going to support people with greater support needs, whether in supported living or residential care, you need to be prepared to resource the support properly. So supported living isn't a way of supporting people with greater support needs on the cheap. So you have to resource it properly wherever that comes from. And in terms of costs, although we didn't get as much information on costs as we hoped for because of kind of COVID restrictions made it quite difficult for services, I think we're really grateful to the services who helped us put this together because it's a really, and continues to be a really difficult time. The costs of services were on average greater for residential care compared to supported living, and that was fairly consistent. And
was
increased
that consistent, sorry, across the range of support needs? So did you find that? Yeah.
Well, we found that people with greater support needs tended to have support that costs more, whether that was supported living or residential care. But residential care was on average more expensive, and that was around the costs of kind of the housing that the people were in.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess, you know, as we said, a lot of my listeners are property investors or supported living providers themselves. What would you say are the relevant bits from the findings that you had, the sort of key messages that people need to be aware of really to implement in their practice going forward?
I'm sure you'll chip in, Lauren, but if I can kick off with a couple of things. I think one is the point I was making just now about support needs and costs, that you need to resource support for people with greater support needs properly so that people can live a fulfilling life. And also that particularly we found with relatives, that kind of relatives' confidence, I guess, in support services, relatives were really, you know, obviously really well tuned in to how well a service was doing. And so that sort of extra resource really matters for relatives to feel that their, you know, son or daughter, usually brother or sister, is somewhere that's safe and fun and fulfilling. I think another thing, again, that we've spoken about is the importance of place. It's really important where somebody is living, as well as who people are living with. And that is a very individualized thing. I think that will really depend on where people's family are, what kind of place they want to live in. As Lauren, you were saying about sort of bus links and public transport links maybe, and also things like access to work. So there was one person, for example, who they did have a job, but because it meant 2 bus rides and they felt quite unsafe coming home late at night, they stopped working in that job. So thinking about how a place kind of affords a fulfilling life for people. I think the final thing that I will point to is the importance of not assuming that people are going to live in a kind of perpetual present, that like all of us, you know, people's aspirations, desires, wishes change over time, and that supported living and commissioners have to be ready to support people to change. That might mean, you know, changing where somebody lives. It might be somebody wanting to change who they live with. Really importantly also, I think, is accessible housing. so that housing can change as people's support needs change. And I think that sort of life course, individualized perspective, which is a real challenge for commissioners to get their head around in the way that current systems work. But I think that is really important for people.
Yeah, that makes, they're basic human rights, aren't they? When you're talking about them and you're listing them there, they're the things that we would all look for when we're looking for somewhere to live and what we would look for in our communities. And it's almost sad that we're having to kind of spell it out, isn't it? You know, but I guess it is really key, and the fact that you've got the evidence behind it is so important to be able to kind of to make it clear to people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was stark for me, I guess, was how the picture didn't seem radically different from 20 years before when we'd been doing the research. And for all our kind of innovation talk, you know, I'm sure, Lauren, you can say more about this, but, you know, the people with learning disabilities that we spoke to were so, you know, I want a front door key, I want a pet, you know, I want a job, I want friends, I want a partner, you know, those things haven't really changed much. I don't know if you've got more to add to that, Lauren.
I was just thinking about, so one of the things we would ask both people and staff is the real tenancy test. So it's sort of a measure of support, what true supported living is supposed to be. I think we found only a quarter of people actually met only a quarter of people's housing setups met the full real tenancy test, which is quite...
So 3/4 didn't meet. That's really shocking, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think within that, one of the main things was about choosing where you live, choosing who you live with, and also sort of choosing your support and when you get support. It was quite common that people they know when they're going to have support, but they don't necessarily choose that or have control over that. Things like your own front door key is sort of tended to be more met within that, and it was more stuff around choice that wasn't met,
because people are sort of told where, oh, there's a space in this house, you're being moved into here. That kind of thing is how people were finding things. And that horrible term, the void, there's a void in this prophecy. Yeah, that absolutely, that's really, really sad, isn't it, that that's still the case. I guess the key message is from the stuff that you're saying, you know, what do you think really needs to change, you know, going forward? What are the things that should be different? What should change? You know, what are the key things you think need to be implemented going forward?
That's a really good question, and I think what we're hoping is that these findings are the start of a conversation with people with learning disabilities, families, commissioners and support providers to actually work through, you know, we have these findings, can we work through what they mean and what you can do practically? Because it's obviously a really difficult time to be a commissioner, to be a support provider. I think it's really difficult times, but I think many of these things aren't about money. They're about kind of relationships of respect. They're about continuity of relationships. They're about, again, I come back to this sense of place. I think that sense of place is really important. And I guess ways of supporting people, particularly things like paid employment, which should be a win-win. Many people want to work. The labour market now might be better for people with learning disabilities than it has been for some time, actually. So things like supporting people into work, supporting strong networks of friendships that aren't dependent on services. So I think there's lots that can be done with a change of kind of mindset, but I think that's tricky for commissioners who are used to thinking at scale to then start to think about kind of individualized life courses.
Coming down to looking at people individually, looking at what they actually need as individuals rather than, you know, big groups of people, or, you know, as one, you're saying there. Yeah.
Yes, because, you know, commissioners commission by service, you know, X number of supported living, whatever. And actually it might be more about trying to be tracking kind of individuals' desires and what that means in terms of what's commissioned.
I'm really interested in the fact that you felt that things hadn't changed so much in 20 odd years. You know, what do you think why is that? What are the main reasons for that, do you think, Chris?
Well, I think the sort of the general landscape of how people with learning disabilities are supported hasn't changed that radically in 20 years, really. I mean, our last sort of significant national strategy in England was valuing people, which was 2001, and then a refresh in 2009. So whatever tone has been set by that. The Care Act probably hasn't made the transformational change that it was originally envisaged to do. So I don't think the landscape's that different. And in some respects, in terms of austerity, for example, I think the environment is more difficult now than it was 20 years ago.
Certainly from a housing point of view, and there are lots of barriers to housing, aren't there? And the current really crazy property market isn't helping getting hold of properties. That's making it very difficult for everybody, isn't it, as well? But I mean, that's only in the last couple of years that's been sort of more of an issue. Are there any other things that you think need to be implemented, Lauren, from talking to people? I guess from a support point of view, you were saying that people felt that they weren't getting choice over the support they received and when they received it. Is there anything practical there that you think providers need to be thinking about?
It's a good question. I'm not sure sort of how one goes about that. I think that's more sort of for the providers. But the thing that sort of stood out to me was around, because we did ask people sort of when they moved in and what it was like. And one of the things we found is often people would move house in an emergency, or if there was something wrong with their previous house. We did find other examples of people moving to sort of fulfill a goal, to get their own place or to live with a partner, but this was a bit rarer. So I would say one of my sort of suggestions would be having conversations about planning ahead, sort of what Chris was saying. Don't just assume if it's working for someone now, that's great, but in 10, 20 years, they may want something different. And the sort of sooner you can start thinking about that and working towards that, the better. And then you sort of reduce that need for having to find somewhere in an emergency and possibly rushing into something. So yeah, just sort of having those conversations and thinking about it and letting people try things. We had examples of people who would move with people they already lived with, but somewhere different, because they knew that they liked living with those people, or they may move to a smaller property nearby to a larger property. So things like that, I think just giving people that choice and the opportunities to try things to sort of find what works for them.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? So people can explore and try different things, and yeah, that really key message that people's life course changes as to what their aspirations and their hopes are, and what they need at different times in their life, like all of us, exactly the same, isn't it? Yeah. And
also, sorry, just to add also about home ownership, giving people the opportunity to, it's something that not many people spoke about, and I'm not sure if it's people weren't aware or it just wasn't something they thought about. But again, that's another thing that people may wish to sort of aspire to and be sort of supported towards.
Were you finding that was a positive reaction from people who had that experience?
I think that the people that we did speak to who own their home, it worked really well for them because they knew that they were there. It's their, it's their place. They're going to be there as long as they want to. If they want to move, it's up to them. It's just that control, really. And it did seem to work really well there weren't many people we spoke to.
No. I think I think it's quite complicated applying for, isn't it? And getting the process. Is that through the hold scheme that you're talking about? Yeah. We'll put the details to that into the show notes as well if people aren't aware of it, so they can explore it and look at it, because you're right, I don't think it's used as much as it could be for some people. Absolutely. Thank you. It's been really brilliant talking to you both and hearing all about your experiences and some really practical tips for people to take forward. We'll put your contact details in the show notes along with the findings in the website, so people can find all of that stuff, and I'm sure people can get in touch if they've got anything specific to ask you. Thank you both for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.